This is you. You've probably been hearing a lot about climate change and how you should reduce your carbon footprint.
We're constantly being told to do our bit for the planet.
You have the power to make a difference from the moment you wake up.
We all have to reduce carbon emissions from our lives.
10 ways that you can reduce your carbon footprint.
Your carbon footprint.
Your carbon footprint.
Your carbon footprint.
And even the people extracting the fossil fuels are telling us how we can play our part. But should I feel guilty about my carbon footprint? Or is this push for personal sacrifices just a distraction from real climate solutions?
Carbon footprint is a measure of the total amount of carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane, CH4, emissions of a defined population, system, or activity, considering all relevant sources, sinks, and storage within the spatial and temporal boundary of the population, system, or activity of interest. Calculated as carbon dioxide equivalent using the relevant 100-year global warming potential, GWP 100. Emissions are mostly a product of what we produce and consume, is the basic idea behind any kind of carbon footprint. It's pretty much common sense. But there's a lot more to this measure than meets the eye. And hidden beneath what could have been a positive idea are very nefarious intentions and some pretty damaging consequences when it comes to climate change. Because even though finding ways to reduce your personal impact on greenhouse gas emissions can be a good thing, that's not what the term carbon footprint is there to do. Carbon footprint comes from the more general ecological footprint, a term coined in the 90s by these guys in this report, which eventually became this book. In this book, the two academics start using the idea of an ecological footprint to talk about how production and consumption are dependent on various uses of resources, namely fossil fuels.
A decade later, this academic concept was picked up by one of the biggest oil companies in the world, British Petroleum. BP made a calculator that let anybody work out their own carbon footprint, and they made sure people knew about it. They took out whole-page adverts in newspapers like the New York Times. They ran commercials on TV.
This is your carbon footprint.
Say again?
Size of what?
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 No idea. What are you meaning?
What is that?
What size is your carbon footprint?
The carbon footprint, that I don't know.
Whatever it is, the whole population of the world, make that a very, very big number.
How much carbon I produce? Is that it?
You mean the effect that my living has on the earth in terms of the products I consume?
And they stuck posters on billboards in airports around the world. Now, oil companies like BP and ExxonMobil had known for decades that burning their products was heating the atmosphere and warping the climate. And at first, the industry tried to deny the science. But then they changed tactics.
BP hired marketing superstars Ogilvy and Mather.
Ogilvy and Mather.
And they gave them the paltry sum of $250 million to make them appear environmentally conscious without the obvious downside of actually having to care about the environment. And these Ogilvy and Mather guys are good. Okay, they're like Don Draper from Mad Men good. And not to belabor this whole Mad Men thing, but do you remember that episode of Mad Men where Don Draper is trying to make the whole Kodak slide wheel cool and everyone's like, we can't do it, we can't make it cool. And Don Draper's like, it's not a wheel, it's a carousel. And everyone's like, oh, Draper, this is why you're the greatest.
In Greek, nostalgia literally means the pain from an old wound.
That's good television. Sorry. Anyway, apparently this whole blank is Greek for other blank thing is an old advertising standby because the Ogilvy and Mather boys named the BP rebrand the Helios campaign, which is of course Greek for sun. Actually spent more money telling people about their solar energy projects than they did on their solar energy projects.
There was no legitimate concern about the global environment, not from one of the companies that stands to profit off of it the most. It was all about shifting the blame from them to you.
By talking about what you and I can do, companies take the pressure off themselves. And it's an idea with a long history in the murky world of public relations. Take these adverts from an environmental non-profit group in the 1970s called Keep America Beautiful.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect
for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't.
The Italian-American actor pretending to be an indigenous man isn't the only dodgy thing going on here. The Keep America Beautiful campaign is funded by the same multinational corporations churning out plastic bottles, companies like Coca-Cola and plastic industry lobby groups. They had found a way to shift the burden of responsibility onto the people buying their products, while still looking like they cared about the environment.
Daddy, you forgot. Every little bit hurts.
The plastic industry wasn't the only one doing this. Researchers have also shown that oil company ExxonMobil mimicked PR tactics used by Big Tobacco to dump responsibility onto their customers. Just look at the words they use. In private, ExxonMobil accepts climate change is caused by fossil fuels, but in public, they talk about consumers and meeting energy demand. Privately, they blame climate change on CO2 emissions, but publicly they focus on all greenhouse gases, without saying what that means for their own fossil fuel production. And instead of talking about the reality of the climate that they've already changed, they downplay it as a risk, potential risk, long-term risk, or potential long-term risk. That last tactic of emphasizing uncertainty comes straight out of the tobacco industry's handbook. Literally. The thing is, these industries are all in the same bind. They want to sell a product that kills. And one tactic the tobacco companies perfected was downplaying the risks while talking up personal choice. As early as the 1920s, tobacco companies were building advertising campaigns around the idea of an individual's freedom to choose. And this caught on in media too. Researchers found the number of news articles framed this way shot up through the 1970s and 80s. But when tobacco companies got taken to court for harming people's health, they flipped the narrative and argued it was the smoker's fault for buying their cigarettes. Choice turned from a symbol of freedom into a tool of blame. It's a similar story for fossil fuel companies. They've argued for a long time that they aren't responsible for the emissions from burning their product.
By selling products like these, we can help our customers reduce their carbon footprint.
The idea that people bear more responsibility for climate change than companies is a greenwashing narrative that has grown popular.
Actual environmentalists adopted the concept and pushed the idea of lowering your carbon footprint as the way to solve climate change.
BP popularized the term carbon footprint so heavily, not because they wanted to balance their emissions checkbook after cashing in on decades worth of oil money, but because they wanted to keep doing it and get you off their backs about it. They wanted to make it your problem. Because when you start thinking it's all your fault, and that solving climate change depends exclusively on your decisions as an individual, your relationship to fossil fuel usage and other commodities is narrowed down to a single identity, that of a consumer. As a consumer, your responsibility is strictly limited to making better individual decisions. Structural change is beyond your purview. Turning off the lights, shorter showers, products with little green stickers. That is the extent of your involvement in the fight against climate change. In that framework, oil companies are just middlemen between you and the thing you want. If you just didn't want it, they wouldn't be there. It's so simple, and there's nothing wrong with that argument. But there is the opposite of nothing wrong with that. There's a whole lot wrong with that, actually. You're not just a consumer, and even if you were, you don't make decisions in a vacuum. For starters, it would be impossible for you to simply make better decisions and reduce your carbon footprint so meaningfully that it would quote-unquote solve climate change on its own. Even if there are things that are technically up to you, some of those choices you have you just can't reasonably be expected to make. Take cars, for example. You'll often hear things about how emissions from transportation are one of the biggest sources of emissions. And while that's true, though pretty insidious depending on how you calculate it, in a country entirely designed around car use, with little to no public transportation, not driving a car makes very little sense for most Americans. Biking, taking the subway, or walking are only options in very few places and for very few people. There is a structural barrier to lowering your car usage that makes that type of consumer decision nearly impossible for most people and incredibly difficult for the remainder. Now, you could switch to electric when your car is near the end of its life, which would reduce your carbon footprint in the long run. But there are structural accessibility issues there too. both in terms of cost and in the lack of charging stations that would make this solution necessarily not apply to most people. And of course, even if switching to electric means moving away from fossil fuels as a direct store of energy, your source of electricity will probably still be fossil fuel powered, and the electric car trade-off includes implicating more rare earth metals into your car's production. Once again, your limitations as a consumer mean that things outside your control get in the way of even the best intentions. Your choices are so heavily constrained and centered around consumption that making better decisions in that kind of environment usually boils down to spending money on the lesser evil some of the time. That is, if you can even afford to make the most environmentally conscious choice. And assuming that choice even amounts to anything in a world where products are endlessly repackaged and greenwashed to trick you. Sometimes the products you can choose from can even be limited by the influence of vested interests. The way that large fossil fuel companies use their incomparable wealth to shut down and slow the growth of electric car projects. Individual decisions like these aren't solutions. They're little more than harm reduction. They do not challenge the direction the arrow is pointing. Solutions, the actual sources of change, aren't found in individualism. They're found in collective action. The fact that sustainable consumption and minding your carbon footprint are presented as a solution is nothing more than a rhetorical trick that maintains the system of profitable pollution in place. Our bottom line is that if we stay rigidly within the logic of carbon footprints, there are serious limits on what we can do to limit the effects of climate change, which means our decisions will have minimal impact. Think back to the part of the pandemic we called the height of the pandemic, when millions of people were locked in place and we saw a dramatic drop in the use of airplanes and cars. Our carbon emissions dropped less than 10% that year and shot right back up in 2021. Without structural change, even massive individual action, involuntary though that instance was, does not change the course on which we are set when we cannot adapt our normal routine away from this amount of pollution at a societal level. The idea of an ecological footprint construes the power equation in reverse order. By making consumers wholly responsible for their consumptive impact, this perspective ignores the critical role of capital, which constrains both the kind and the quantity of goods that are thrown into the market. The gasoline in your tank flowed through the hands of innumerable people seeking profit. Oil exploration technology consultants, production companies, rig service firms, pipeline companies, gas station operators. Yet you are the one responsible for the footprint simply because you pressed the gas leading to the emissions? When it comes to consumption, every commodity has users and profiteers along the chain. We should place the bulk of responsibility on those profiting from production, not simply people fulfilling their needs. This is not a moral calculus as much as an objective assessment of who has the power along these commodity chains. Of course, we don't want to completely ignore the responsibility of those few wealthy consumers who buy fuel-inefficient cars, eat steak twice a week, and fly excessively. But why do we only focus on their consumption as the proper zone of responsibility and politics? When we recognize that the real decision-making power is in the hands of people who stand to profit from fossil fuel extraction, we can see that the solution isn't desperately and inefficiently signaling to them with our purchases what we want, but actually seizing that power of decision-making ourselves. We should get to decide what resources we want, in what amounts, and how best to approach acquiring them, not letting whatever makes the most money govern which way our lives go. The answer, so to speak, is then to reconceptualize what environmental action is. It's about centering it around solidarity and collective action, not individual choices, since they often frame the burden of being better on people who are already struggling to satisfy their basic needs. It's understanding that to resolve issues of climate change, we can't simply urge people to consume less. We need to guarantee the security of their access to the things they truly need and decommodify, in other words, remove from market pressures, the resources which we know are creating profit around pollution. It's shifting the power of decision-making about what we do regarding stuff that pollutes away from fossil fuel companies and their deceptive ad agencies and into our hands, unobstructed from the naturally perverting effects of voting with your dollar schemes that will always just bolster whichever industry had the most money to start off with. Plans like the Green New Deal, which attach environmentalism to a jobs guarantee, to healthcare, to the transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewable sources of energy, do this kind of stuff, though admittedly still within a social democratic framework. As much as possible, we need to make sure that the Green New Deal and other ways to reassert our collective power over our common future are going to be the way forward. It's time to stop taking the bait on corporate schemes like the individual carbon footprint. There is nothing we can achieve alone that wouldn't be better together. We need collective action.
This story of going green, even though we see it everywhere, has some serious shortcomings. It says that if I become a smarter shopper and tell all my friends to do the same, I've done my part. And if I don't buy all this green stuff, then it's my fault the planet's being destroyed. Wait a minute, my fault? I didn't choose to put toxic products on the shelves or allow slave labor in factories around the world. I didn't choose to fill stores with electronics that can't be repaired and have to be thrown away. I didn't choose a world in which some people can afford to live green, leaving the rest of us to be irresponsible planet wreckers.
Instead of letting ourselves off the hook by simply pledging to eat less meat or take fewer transatlantic flights, we need to shake off the mindset of individualism and consumerism, and start to see ourselves as an interconnected group of people with a common goal. The prevailing cultural zeitgeist in the West, the willingness to see ourselves as merely consumers as opposed to citizens, is no accident. That mindset was built, slowly and deliberately, over several decades. Since Reagan and Thatcher, the prime motivation of government has been to deregulate, privatize, give tax cuts to corporations, and remove any barriers to the exercise of unaccountable corporate power, while dismantling anything even remotely threatening to private power, especially unions and regulatory committees. In the 40 years since these policies have become staples of Western governance, corporations have been able to amass mountains of profit and thereby manipulate the very government that gave them their power.
If we actually want to change the world, we can't talk only about consumers voting with our dollars. Real change happens when citizens come together to demand rules that work. So how do we make big change? To answer that question, I went back and looked at Gandhi, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the US civil rights movement, and the environmental victories here in the 1970s. They didn't just nag people to perfect their day-to-day choices, they changed the rules of the game.
We are in the midst of a crisis, as predicted 4 decades ago by the very orchestrators of the crisis, and they will not give up their control without a fight. Throughout history, only mass movements have been able to turn the tide against seemingly insurmountable odds. We have to stop thinking as individuals and reignite the natural human desire to work together to make the world a better place for all of us.
It turns out there are 3 things you find whenever people get together and actually change the world. First, they share a big idea for how things could be better. Not just a little better for a few people, a whole lot better for everyone. And they don't just tinker around the edges. They go right to the heart of the problem, even when it means changing systems that don't want to be changed. And that can be scary. Hey, millions of us already share a big idea for how things can be better. Instead of this dinosaur economy that focuses only on corporate profits, we want a new economy that puts safe products, happy people, and a healthy planet first. Duh! Isn't that what an economy should be for? Trying to live eco-perfectly in today's system is like trying to swim upstream when the current is pushing us all the other way. But by changing what our economy prioritizes, we can change that current so that the right thing becomes the easiest thing to do. Second, the millions of ordinary people who made these extraordinary changes didn't try to do it alone. They didn't just say, I will be more responsible. They said, we will work together until the problem is solved. Finally, these movements succeeded in creating change because they took their big idea and their commitment to work together, and then they took action. Did you know that when Martin Luther King Jr. organized his March on Washington, less than 1/4 of Americans supported him? But that was enough to make change because those supporters took action. They did stuff. Today, 74% of Americans support tougher laws on toxic chemicals. 83% want clean energy laws. 85% think corporations should have less influence in government. We've got the big idea and the commitment. We just haven't turned it all into massive action yet. And this is our only missing piece. So let's do it.
Revolutions are philosophical. Getting organized and preventing the culprits camouflaging the real problem means it's possible to embark on a bloodless revolution against the violent organizations and barbaric leaders who have corporatized democracy, stunted progress, perverted the course of human destiny, and compromised the future of this planet. History is littered with examples of people who threw themselves off the yoke of oppression to adopt radical change, only to end up with popular new rulers that maintained the status quo. To really understand something is to be liberated from it. Dedicating oneself to a great cause, taking responsibility, and gaining self-knowledge is the essence of being human. A predatory capitalist's truest enemy and humanity's greatest ally is the self-educated individual who has read, understood, delays their gratification, and walks around with their eyes wide open.